Okay, great. So,
Okay, so sorry, our next speaker is Richard Booth, and he will introduce the cuDisc code. Go ahead, Richard.
great. So I'm going to talk about a code we developed here to model essentially grain growth and evolution of dust, and also we're now coupling it to volatiles in protoplanetary disks. So this is similar to a lot of things that you'll have seen already, but the key difference here is that we're trying to model the vertical structure in the disk as well as the radial structure. Okay, so so this is genuinely a 2D code where we're modeling the radial distance from the star, the vertical direction. We're assuming actually some symmetric here, and we're treating the same kinds of things you'd have heard of before. So dust dynamics, so this would be advection and diffusion of dust, grain growth, radiative transfer to get the temperature structure, and gas evolution, along with this adsorption and desorption of molecules. So the gas evolution we're actually treating very simply. We're doing it in a parameterized way using either a viscous evolution model or something like that. For the vertical direction, typically choosing hydrostatic equilibrium. The reason for doing it this way is that we're trying to simulate essentially the 2D structure and how it evolves over the full lifetime of a protoplanetary disk, so of order a million years or so. And we're motivated here to study problems where the thermal structure and the dust dynamics are feeding back on each other to affect, the physics we care about. So one such problem here is actually the entrainment of dust in photoevaporative winds. So the figure on the right here is an example of that. And the point here is that there's interactions between essentially the dust and the radiation pressure that affect the temperature structure in the disk. And this temperature structure also determines whether these dust grains are able to escape. So my plan today is to talk a little bit about the physics that's included in the code, and then present briefly at the end a couple of examples of what we've used this for. Okay. So that's more or less what I've said. So yeah, if you want to think about what this code is, it's essentially doing similar things to what you would do with DustPy. DustPy is a 1D vertically integrated code, but here we're doing it in 2 dimensions. Okay. So the dust dynamics is done using a standard finite volume method, which means we divide our grid up into our disk up into a bunch of cells. And our cells are essentially fixed in time. And on those cells, we specify things like the amount of dust, the speed it's moving, things like this. We're going to solve for the evolution of that. The methods we're using are essentially the same as Athena++. They're very mature. The one slightly odd thing about cuDisc is the shape of the grid structure we're using here. So we're not using a classical Cartesian or cylindrical grid or a spherical grid that you'd actually see in a typical hydrodynamic simulation. We're using a grid that has the edges of our cells that are at constant cylindrical radius and constant angle above the midplane theta. So a polar angle and a cylindrical radius. The reason for this is that it allows us to do 2 important things very easily. So one of those is ray tracing the stellar radiation. We can just do that straight along the grid lines. And the other thing is hydrostatic equilibrium can be easily computed. And these 2 essentially assumptions make it very easy to do these things in a exactly conservative way. So it adds a little bit of complexity for the dynamics, but actually the basic dynamics, so the advection and diffusion of dust is not too difficult. So for the dust dynamics, what we solve here is essentially the continuity equation and the momentum equation for all of the different dust species. In the code here, we actually use what I would call a size resolving method. So rather than just including large and small grains, like some of the codes will do, we'll actually have a whole range of grain sizes, say typically 1 to 200 dust bins covering sizes from sub-micron up to millimeter or centimeter sizes. And we'll solve the dynamics of each of these species independently with their motions coupled to the gas. It's actually incredibly important for us to properly solve the momentum equation for the dust in this problem, because in the upper layers above the disk, if I go back, the dust can decouple, and essentially the motion of this dust is determined by essentially that interaction, and the integration of the momentum equation is essential to get that right. I'm showing here a simple test comparing the results of the code to analytical solutions from Takeuchi and Lin, that demonstrating that it works very well. And yeah, okay, that's all I want to say here. One slightly tricky thing in developing the code, a problem we had to solve, was essentially getting diffusion to work properly on non-orthogonal grids. So diffusion depends on essentially the gradient of some species. For dust, it's going to be the concentration of dust, so that essentially the dust to gas ratio. And you need to compute that gradient perpendicular to the cell face. When you have a non-orthogonal grid, you find that the lines between two cells, the center of two cells, are no longer perpendicular to the interface. And that means that to get the fluxes, you have to recompute essentially the gradient of the quantity you're interested in, here the dust density, in 2 dimensions. So both along the line between the cells and perpendicular to the line between the cells. So we do this using, so this essentially involves coupling some extra cells into the problem. So there's an example here. If we're computing the flux between these 2 cells here, this flux depends on not only the 2 cells either side of it, but it also ends up depending on this cell down here in the bottom left and the one up here. So we end up with a slightly bigger stencil. But when factoring that in and implementing it, we get essentially very robust ability to compute diffusion. The same scheme is essentially used for anywhere we need to do diffusion. That's radiative diffusion, dust diffusion, molecules. So if you wanted to use the code and extend it and look at something else, you could use the framework that's already there. Right. So how do we do the temperature structure? So with the temperature structure, we're solving the dust radiative transfer problem. And we're doing this with a hybrid multi-band flux limited diffusion method. So this is very similar to what people like Ralph Kuiper and Bert have developed in the past. The one improvement we have here is that we treat the re-emitted radiation, the thermal radiation from the disk, in a multi-band way. So actually, we ray trace the radiation from the star, doing this in a frequency-dependent way, and we can do it up to essentially arbitrary accuracy. But then the stellar radiation that's scattered and the re-emitted thermal radiation from the disk is treated using flux-limited diffusion. The reason why we need to do this in a multi-band way is because the midplane is heated by radiation that's come from the upper layers, where the disk is hot and the radiation field is a relatively short wavelength, and the midplane is cooler, which is then emitting radiation at longer wavelengths. To make the process relatively computationally efficient, we trace the stellar radiation with around 100 bands, but use sort of 10 to 20 bands to treat the re-emitted thermal radiation. So when we do this, it actually works quite well. What I'm showing here is essentially some benchmarks, which we compared to RADMC3D. So the left panel here is showing a couple of multi-band results to a gray hybrid flux-limited diffusion. So this is a single band. And you can see that compared to the Monte Carlo solution, we actually get a much better agreement with the midplane temperature. And this is essentially because the optical depth at one wavelength, the wavelength that the heating's happening at, is different to the optical depth of the wavelength that the cooling's happening at, and we can capture that much more accurately in a multi-band method. So on the right is then showing this sort of typical benchmark problem from Christoph Pant, which is just the temperature structure in a protoplanetary disk. And we get relatively good agreement with the temperature in the midplane and in the upper layers for both relatively low mass and higher mass disks. So the accuracy here is typically with about 10%, which is perfectly fine for what we're trying to do here. We included coagulation. We're solving here the full coagulation equation using the so-called Smolyakovsky approach. This is essentially exactly the same kind of physics that's treated in DustPy. You work out how quickly grains are colliding with each other and the outcome of those collisions, whether it's growth or fragmentation. And you use that to exchange mass between bins of different sizes. So, coagulation takes mass from 2 smaller bins and puts it into a big one, and then fragmentation does the opposite. Benchmarking this against DustPy with the dynamic switch off, we see actually really good agreement. The code agrees well, which is what you'd expect when the physics is the same. So a key part of computing these rates is essentially how quickly dust grains collide with each other. We do this including the standard physics, so turbulence and Brownian motion. This turbulence is treated using the formalism from Ormel and cuSy. For the dynamics, we take that, sorry, for the laminar velocities, like the radial velocity and the azimuthal velocity, we take that directly from the dynamics solver and pass that into the coagulation routine. And so that works very nicely. So I want to emphasize here that the code is modular. It's pretty easy to turn on and off any of the different bits you want, whether that's dynamics, the temperature solver, coagulation. To make this code efficient, we've implemented a sub-stepping scheme where the different parts of the code are run on different time steps. So the overall global time stepping of the scheme is controlled by the hydrodynamics. So every cycle of the code, we're going to do a dust dynamics update. We're going to update the gas structure in the disk. We're then going to check if we need to update the temperature, which sort of depends on how quickly the temperature structure is changing. If so, we'll do a new calculation of the ready to transfer. Then we'll check if we need to do the dust growth. So we'll then do the dust growth, and then we'll go around to the start. Both the dust growth and the temperature solver, if they need to iterate, they will iterate themselves. So typically early on in the calculation, if you start off with very small grains, coagulation will need lots of small time steps, and so it will sub-cycle itself to make that as accurate as needed. So this approach allows us to achieve both efficiency and accuracy. And so now onto a couple of applications. So the first thing we did was essentially ask the question, well, if you put all of this physics in and you solve dust dynamics in 2D, how much does it change the results? So we set up sort of a simple static protoplanetary disk with a dust trap in at about 5 AU, and we compared essentially the results we got from cuDisc to what you get from dustPy. So if you look at bulk properties, such as the grain size distribution vertically integrated, so this is at 6 AU, so just outside the dust trap, you see actually very similar results to the different codes, and the size distributions for the different results are also typically very similar. So these bulk properties show you that actually the 1D vertically integrated structure from cuDisc, not from cuDisc, from dustPy is doing actually a really good job. But things do start to differ when you want to dig into the vertical structure. Essentially the vertical structure of the dust dynamics can change quite a lot depending on what physics is going on. To make a comparison to dustPy, we obviously had to blow up the vertically integrated model into essentially a vertically resolved structure, and we did that essentially doing it the standard way that people do when they want to make radiative transfer models of dustPy simulation. So using a Gaussian vertical structure, assuming settling equilibrium. And so you can see that while some of the dust grains actually follow the dustPy solution quite well, you can actually get large differences at certain sizes. In some cases, we actually see that the solution by cuDisc has more dust at higher altitudes than in dustPy, and in other cases there's less. So this is the case here. And so there's a bunch of different effects going on to drive this. So one of these effects is essentially the trapping of small grains in the midplane. So this was first seen by Sebastian Freit and Fred Sessler. And so what happens is if you have lots of fragmentation in the midplane, then these small grains that are produced can actually stick onto large grains quicker than they can mix up into the upper layers. So that can give you a depletion of dust from the upper layers. Or alternatively, because the dust grains become more decoupled at higher altitudes, you can get higher collision velocities, and that can lead to stronger growth or stronger fragmentation at higher velocities than you might expect, and that can change the structure from the Gaussian stuff. So if you're interested in actually the vertical structure and what's going on at a couple of heights above the midplane, the simple approximations may not be good enough for you. So the type of problem we actually developed this code to do is something like this dust clearing by photoevaporation. So here the idea is that essentially as a disk is being destroyed by photoevaporation at the end of its lifetime, you need to not only remove the gas, but you need to remove the dust. And we think that this probably happens by some kind of combination of entrainment in the wind and being blown out by radiation pressure. So the reason we needed to develop this code to do this is that the wind wants to carry the dust upwards essentially, but radiation pressure wants to push the dust outwards. And if you have a typical flared disk structure, because of the flaring, dust grains that are being pushed outwards end up just intersecting the outer parts of the disk again, and they don't escape. when you get left with this problem that is, you get rid of the gas, the dust is left behind. So how do you clear it? So we needed to know how essentially this process of the wind clearing affects the shape of the photosphere, and that's why one of the big reasons why we developed this code. When we did it, we also found some interesting results. We could get, essentially enhancement in small grain populations. So this is around a few micron sizes. This was essentially driven by the fact that there is an equilibrium between dust grains being lifted up by the wind and settling. So there's a size that neither settles nor grows. And essentially this size that neither settles nor grows can be further populated by enhanced collisions due to the high velocities in the upper layers of the disk that are coming from essentially the radiation pressure and the wind. So this is another area where essentially the 2D structure provided surprising results. So yeah, the code is fully publicly available. You can download it on GitHub. You can just use it. It's pretty tricky to use and get working. So if you have problems, don't hesitate to contact me or Alfie Robinson, who was also one of the main developers of this. Yeah, and I'll just finish by summarizing again and saying that essentially we developed this code to look at what's going on with dust growth and evolution in the upper layers of protoplanetary disks. Existing models like DustPy actually do a really good job of getting the bulk properties like the surface density evolution and those kinds of things in disks. But if you care about the upper layers, then this code may help you understand what's going on. Yeah, thanks. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. Are there any questions? Yes, Bert?
Yeah, thank you. This is super cool. Maybe I missed it. Could you say something about the runtime of the code?
Oh yeah, I mean, I forgot to say that. So this is GPU accelerated because these are in normal hydrodynamic terms 3D, right? You've got radius, height, and grain size. So you're typically running with 10 to the 7, 10 to the 8 cells here when you do a simulation. And so we're running these on GPUs, and we can do it. Depends a bit on problem setup because the closer you go to the star, the shorter the time scale, right? But we can do, say, a disk that you truncate around a couple of AU. We can do 1 million years in a week or two on a powerful GPU. So there's still expensive simulations, as you might expect, but we can comfortably do a significant fraction of the disk lifetime.
Ah, cool, super cool. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Richard? Yes, Eduard?
Hello, Richard. Thank you for a very nice talk. If you could go to the slide showing the radiative transfer there quickly.
Sure, yeah, just hold on a second while I pull that up.
Well, basically, when you show the Planck function, right? Or
this one?
yes, yeah. So that's I don't know. Okay, so there must be very steep dependence of temperature here. Do you linearize it or what?
Yeah, so when we actually solve this, we solve it using preconditioned biconjugate gradient stabilized method.
Yeah.
And we're using an LU preconditioner, and so that helps us, an incomplete LU preconditioner, that helps us a lot. The other way we linearize this is essentially because the timescales in disks are quite long, the radiation field is quite close to the steady state. So we linearize this using t to the 4 as our linearization variable. And then essentially most of these things are essentially perfectly linear.
Yes. So t to the 4 you linearize, basically extending into the Taylor series. Did you try to use Newton iterations
So, I mean, we could do Newton iteration to update things like the Planck opacity and things like this. But rather than doing that, essentially a Newton iteration involves essentially solving this linearized equation multiple times. So instead, we just elect to update the temperature structure more frequently.
No. What I mean by Newton iterations, you just find the temperature, right? After linearization, you find the temperature after solving for one time step, and then
Yes.
you substitute again, find the energy and substitute it again. So basically iterate, like subcycle.
Oh, so you'd split
Yeah.
split the temperature in the radiation field into two.
Yeah, yes, and then they converge quickly. Usually a few iterations, it can increase the accuracy greatly.
So,
I mean, if you're interested, you can contact me.
Yeah, so that's an interesting idea. So we're solving them together in a coupled way, together in one big coupled step, and that works perfectly fine for us.
I can send you slides basically where it's explained the streak by Newton iterations, and it quickly converges. If you use a few iterations, you get much better.
Sure.
solution.
Thanks.
Okay, well, if there are any more questions, well then let's thank Richard again. Maybe Peter. Okay. One quick question from Peter.
Very quickly. So do I understand that this is not a kind of fully ray tracing radius transfer, but you kind of approximate this in two directions, like upward and radially, and then you do something approximative, yeah?
So the stellar radiation field, which is very collimated, right? We treat it's essentially exactly, apart from our stars, a point source rather than has a finite size.
Sure.
But then the re-emitted thermal radiation is treated in the diffusion approximation. Yeah. So the difference we do to what most people have done before is that we're solving, 10 to 20 different diffusion problems at different wavelengths. So, I mean, I wouldn't use this to compute the SED because I don't know how well the radiation field is captured in the optically thin limit, but it allows the disk to cool through optically thin wavelengths properly through the presence of the Thorst term in here, right? Which isn't necessarily possible in a gray method.
Very similar in Podimo, where we initially set the mean intensities before we go into the full radius transfer. So basically, it's a two-stream approximation, as you say. You have this geometrically very narrow pencil from the star, and then vertically, and then you do a little bit of transfer along that radiation. That gives you basically a very good approximation already before you in the end enter the full radius transfer. Yeah.
Yeah, I was pleased with how well it works, actually. So yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, there seem to be no more questions. So thank you, Richard, for your presentation.
You're welcome.